Today we're going to talk about fraction basics, and we're not going to use a calculator. And specifically what we're going to talk about and remind ourselves of is how do we add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. First of all, over here to the left of the screen, we have something written as a fraction here, and the A is called the numerator. And I sometimes refer to it as the top of the fraction. The B is called the denominator, which I sometimes refer to as the bottom of the fraction. And then overall, this is a fraction. And the line here means division. A divided by B. And what we need to refresh our memory with is how do we add or subtract a fraction? When we add or subtract fractions, we have to find a common denominator. But when we multiply and divide, we do not need to find a common denominator. If we look specifically here at the multiply, no common denominator, but we multiply straight across. We multiply the numerators together, and then we multiply the denominators together. To divide fractions, again, we do not need to find a common denominator. The little saying that I have that's up by the clock for those of you who are in the classroom says, when dividing fractions, don't ask why, flip the second one and multiply. And that's pretty much what's written down here on number 3. To divide fractions, don't ask why, just flip the second and multiply. And here's how they work. Well, our first couple are multiplication here. We're going to multiply the numerators, which are the top of the fractions. We're going to multiply the denominators, the bottom of the fraction. And then we'll simplify if we need to. 2 times 6 is 12. 3 times 5 is 15. And once we multiply, we ask ourselves, is there any number that goes into both 12 and 15? And since 3 goes into both of them, we're going to divide both top and bottom by 3. And 12 divided by 3 is 4, and 15 divided by 3 is 5. Again, multiplying. We do not need a common denominator. We multiply the tops of the fraction. In this case, -1 times 4 is -4. We multiply the bottoms of the fractions. 3 times 10 is 30. And once again, we ask ourselves, is there any number that goes into both and 30? Well, 4 divided by 2. 30 divided by 2. -4 divided by 2 is -2. 30 divided by 2 is 15. And the nice thing about division is, if we know the little saying, when dividing, don't ask why, flip the second one and multiply, we're going back to multiplication. But on this particular problem, on letter C, it's 3/1. And when we rewrite this, when dividing, don't ask why, flip the second one and multiply. And we just learned when we multiply the numerators, the tops of the fractions. 5 times 1 is 5. We multiply the denominators, the bottoms of the fractions. 2 times 3 is 6. And the nice thing on this problem is that there's no number that goes into both 5 and 6. Again with multiplication and division, no common denominator, but with division, we need to also remember When dividing, don't ask why, flip the second one and multiply. 7 times 2 is 14. 5 times 1 is 5. So let's move on to addition and subtraction, and specifically here to start, the addition. And we're going to find the common denominator. And for those of you who are better at fractions than not, you will see that the common denominator, the least common denominator on this problem is 6. I'm not going to approach it that way for now. I'm trying to help specifically people who really struggle with fractions more so. But when we look at this particular problem, I'm going to rewrite it as 1/2, leave some space, and then put our plus, and then sum 6. And the common denominator, even though it won't necessarily be the least common denominator, is found by taking the denominator of 2 and multiplying it by the denominator of 6. 2 times 6 is 12. I know that that is not the least common denominator, but this will still work. Now what's going to happen is we need to figure out, well, what's the numerator going to become? Well, in order to get that, we took 2 and we multiplied by 6 to get 12. And the thing is, if we multiply the bottom by 6, we need to multiply the top by 6. So this becomes 6 twelfths. Over here in our second fraction, what did we multiply 6 by to get 12? Well, we multiplied it by 2. If we multiply the bottom by 2, then we need to multiply the top by 2. And 7 times 2 is 14. Once we have the common denominator, then what we're going to do to finish here, or at least get close to finishing, is we're going to add the numerator. 6 plus 14 is 20. The 12 stays 12. We found the common, so we're just going to add the top part. And lastly, then we need to ask ourselves, do we have something that goes into both 20 and 12 evenly? And if we divide by 4 here, 20 divided by 4 is 5, 12 divided by 4 is 3. A little bit simpler process if you were able to find the least common denominator, which we did not do. On letter B, remember once again, if there's nothing written underneath, then it's a 1. I'm going to write it with spacing here. 4/3, leave a little bit of space, plus 9, over 1. And we want to find the common denominator. Well, the common denominator is 3 times 1. So it's going to be 3. Well, what we multiplied 3 by from our first fraction is we multiplied by 1. And if we multiply the bottom of the fraction by 1, then we also have to multiply the top of the fraction by 1. And we get 4/3. Over here with 9, we multiplied 1 by 3 to get 3. So we have to multiply the top of the fraction by 3 as well. We sometimes call that a fancy form of 1, the 3/3. Fancy form of 1, and 9 times 3 is 27. And again, when we add or subtract fractions, we have to have the common denominator, but once we determine what the common denominator is, it stays. And we add the numerator, the top. 4 plus 27 is 31. You do not need to convert that back to 10 1/3. If you want to, that's fine, but we're perfectly happy with the 31/3, which is called an improper fraction. Letter C. Finding the common denominator. The easiest way to find the common denominator is to multiply the two denominators together. 2 times 5 is 10. Before I put that in there, I'm going to write 5 halves with a little bit of extra space. minus the 8/5. Again, our common denominator determined by taking the two denominators, the two bottom values. 2 times 5 is 10. Well, 2 times 5 is 10. And if we multiply the bottom of the fraction by 5, then we need to multiply the top of the fraction by 5. Again, sometimes known as the fancy form of 1, that 5 over 5. And 5 times 5 is 25. Use the same process here on our second fraction. Well, 5 times 2 is 10. So we have to do 8 times 2. And 8 times 2 is 16. We're subtracting this time, but the only part that's going to get subtracted is the top. The denominator of 10 is going to remain the same, and 25 minus 16 is 9. 9/10 is what we end up with. Adding and subtracting means that we need to find a common denominator. The nice part on letter D is we have a whole number and we have a fraction. Then we can add these two together. 6 plus 2/3 is 6 and 2/3. And that kind of number is called a mixed number there because it's got a whole number part and a fraction part. But using this, we didn't even have to find a common denominator. By the way, to convert to an improper fraction, what we do is we take 3 times 6, which is 18, plus 2 is 20 thirds. And if you did go back and find a common denominator between 1 and 3, which it would be 3, and you added these together, you would eventually end up with the 20 thirds. We are fine with the answer of 6 and 2/3. We are also fine with the answer of 20 thirds. Letter E. Negative 2/6 plus 8/3. Gonna find a common denominator. Once again here. And by the way, for those of you who are a little bit more advanced with fractions, the least common denominator is 6. One of the things that you can ask yourselves is, does 3, the smaller denominator, go into the bigger denominator of 6 evenly? So the common denominator really is 6, but I'm going to stick with the 18 again, especially for those people who struggle with the fractions. But when we start to write this, it's negative 2/6, leave some space, plus 8/3. And when we write this, our common denominator, like I said, is 18. It's not the least common denominator, but it will work. And what we did to get at least a common denominator is we took 6 times 3 is 18. And if we multiply our bottom of our fraction by 3, then we need to multiply the top of our fraction by 3. And negative 2 times 3 is negative 6. On our second fraction, we multiplied 3 times 6 to get 18. And if we multiply the bottom there by 6, then we need to multiply the top by 6. And 8 times 6 is 48. And once we have those values there, we can finish the problem. Negative 6 plus 48 is 42 18ths. And then the question is, can we reduce or simplify that fraction a little bit more? Is there any number that goes into both 42 and 18? And hopefully you realize that it's 6. And 42 divided by 6 is 7. And 18 divided by 6 is 3. Letter F. To add or subtract fractions, we have to have a common denominator. On letter F, we're fortunate enough that we have a common denominator. We've got 5/4 plus 3/4. Leave the denominator alone. So we added the 5 and the 3. We kept the denominator of 4. And lastly, can we divide 8 divided by 4? It's 2. So as we get close to finishing here, I do want to do letter G with the common denominator, with the least common denominator for that matter. And the advantage of adding or subtracting with the least common denominator is that you probably don't need to simplify in the end. But as we take a look at this one, again, what I said previously is, will 3 go into 6 evenly? Well, 3 will go into 6 evenly. So as we write this fraction down, 21/6, leave a little bit of space, minus 5/3. 3 goes into 6. Our least common denominator is 6. And now, what's going to happen here is, well, we multiplied 6 by 1 to get 6. So we need to multiply 21 by 1. And we've got 21/6. Over here in our second fraction, 3 times 2 is 6. So 5 times 2 is 10. And now that we have that, we can finish this problem. 21 minus 10 is 11. Divided by 6. Notice once again that we did not touch the denominator. This time we did find the least common denominator, and we did not have to simplify in the end. Lastly, 3 minus 1/3. I hope there's a couple people that are in this classroom or watching the video who can go, oh yeah, I know what the answer is. It's 2 2/3. But if you aren't one of those people, we have to find the common denominator. So this is going to be 3 over 1, leave a little bit of space, minus 1/3, and our common denominator. 1 times 3 is 3. So our common denominator is 3. And this time what we did is we multiplied 1 by 3. So we have to multiply 3 by 3. Fancy form of 1. 3 times 3 is 9. On our other fraction, well, 3 times 1 is 3. So 1 times 1 is 1. And our common denominator, like I said, is 3. And 9 minus 1 is 8.